Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Dickie and Mark and the USF library system and Equality Florida and for the Pride Alliance for having me here tonight. It is a great honor and great joy, and I am doubly honored by the fact that this is going to be an evening of conversation with Kendall Workman.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Let's just get the ball rolling, eh?
Okay.
All right, so you wrote your new book, and it's called A New Way to Be Human. What do you think you've discovered about yourself in the process?
Well, it's a great question. There was a previous manuscript. It was twice as long, and several publishing houses said to my literary agent, you know, Robert's obviously quite bright, which was nice to hear being affirmed. But he quotes too many people, and he's got a story to tell, and it's not coming through in these pages. And so she said to me, you know, we can keep shopping this manuscript. And I said, no, 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 stop right there. There was just something that I intuitively knew was correct in those comments. And so as I rewrote the manuscript and essentially created a new manuscript, I realized that the cutting edge for me and the thing that I was learning most about was how to be both authentic and authentic through the written word in a way that required a certain amount of courage for me. I've tried to live my life with a sense of authenticity. It's been one of my sort of guideposts through life. But when you actually start to commit yourself to paper, it takes on a whole different emphasis. And I think the courage in all of that for me was possible because of why it was that I wanted to write the book, which is that in over 30 years of working with people as a clergy person, as a community activist, as an interspiritual leader, I've increasingly heard people ask questions such as, you know, what does it matter if I get involved, or my vote doesn't count, or my voice doesn't really matter in the scheme of things. And I believe that that kind of approach says, you know, I'm helpless and I choose to be disengaged. And I believe that life invites us to be profoundly and deeply engaged, which means being centered and present to who we are in all of our magnificence and all of our complexity. But part of what I've discovered over the years is that there are also people who have an incredibly hard time with organized religion, perhaps because of the way in which some react to women, to people of color, to the LGBT community, and the list goes on and on. And many of those say, you know, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual. And so the book is really written as an invitation to those who know that there is a spirituality about our lives, to be grounded in that, to celebrate it, and to also walk into and accept some invitations to go to the edge of our fear, to the places of courage, to the places of new compassion and hope for ourselves, and therefore for others. And so I think that's been just an amazing learning for me that continues as I engage with people and learn their reactions to the book.
NPR recently featured you in a segment about your life, and they called it Standing Tall. So how do you think you're able to stand tall as not only a gay man and a leader, but a spiritual person?
You know, I believe that each of us is invited to stand tall in the wonder of who we are. And I say that as a gay man who has struggled with my sexual identity, a gay man who as a teenager thought about committing suicide and actually took an overdose of pills one night. But I didn't know enough about the process, thank God, because it didn't work. But to know that for each of us, our lives are made up of many facets, and that when we go to those places that invite us to confront our fears or the things that keep us from being authentic, that's really where we learn both love and courage. And so in the NPR story on I'm blanking out on the name of the show, Snap Judgment, we spoke about my experience of healing as a teenager in South Africa. I had had a series of unsuccessful spinal surgeries and was being threatened with a third operation, and was told that if it didn't happen, I would probably be paralyzed from the waist down by my early 20s. And I'd become part of a fairly fundamentalist Thursday night Bible study held in the home of the Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town, whose name was Bill Burnett. And one night after the Thursday night prayer meeting, his chaplain said, "The Archbishop wants to pray with you." I was terrified. All I could think of was that he had discovered that I was gay and that he was going to try an exorcism. Now, he might have hoped that he could do an exorcism when I tell you a little bit more about the story. So he prayed with me for healing, and as he laid his hands on my head and then lifted me up, he said to me, "Robert, your spine will never enclose you again." And I had no idea what those words meant. But what they did was, in realizing that the symptoms had disappeared and that the orthopedic surgeon said that from new x-rays my spine looked absolutely wonderful, I had not even considered the possibility of believing in physical healing. But I was invited as a result of that to go and speak in a small black church. And this was in the mid-70s in South Africa. And there I was as a white kid, a minority for the first time, being received graciously and warmly, and meeting people who refused to have their spirits assailed or put down by the system of apartheid. They refused to have somebody try to enclose them from their most beloved self. And so I was finding myself learning incredible things about the human spirit and about the capacity to persist in believing in the possibility of change, even when change seemed daunting and at times impossible. And I think the real sort of question for me about standing tall was years later. I was in a football stadium at the funeral service for Steve Biko, a murdered black South African leader. And there were over 30,000 people there. And at the end of this long, full-day African funeral, a man of small stature came onto the stage to lead the funeral service. And his name was Desmond Tutu. And he could have swayed that crowd to do anything. But instead, he said, "If you pick up stones or guns or weapons like those who have killed Biko, you will become just like them, and you will destroy your own humanity." And then he said, and he kept repeating this incessantly, "Please, please, please be partners in the work of love." And I knew intuitively that that invitation of his was true, but I was terrified because I had been accepted as a candidate for ordination. And I knew that if I revealed my sexuality, that I would be removed from that process. And so for me, the journey to standing tall has meant, quite literally, standing tall physically in spite of and as a result of those surgeries many, many years ago when I was a teenager, but learning to stand tall and come to believe that the love that Tutu spoke about is in fact a love that we are invited to embrace about our own self. And when we can embrace it about ourselves, then also for others.
Well, do you believe that there's a spiritual void here, in the LGBT community? It's probably resulted from history of, condemnation of, organized religion. A lot of people say all the time. Christians, organized religion is really what it's about. And so if you think that, what do you think we can do about it?
Well, I think there's some very interesting dynamics in the LGBT community. I think, without question, far too many religions of every stripe have been unrelenting in their hatred, in their denunciation, and in their vitriol towards us. And there are others who have been perhaps more cautious and careful in their language. And yet there are also those within the structures of organized religion who have had the courage to say, this is a religious issue because it is about people who are made in the image of a creator. They have tended to be a minority. And I think I see all too often many LGBT people and our allies writing religion off. And while I understand that, I would suggest that when you can find a religious community that is truly open and embracing, that may be something that is life-giving. But I also find that for significant numbers of the LGBT community and our allies, that there is at work a profound sense of being spiritual. It is very hard to do the work that we, and in many cases our family members, have done in terms of coming to be at peace and coming to celebrate who we are as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender people, that getting to that place requires spiritual work. The word spirituality itself, in its Latin origin, means breath of life. And so when we do that inner work, and when we're proud of who we are, and proud of our LGBT friends and family, we are, in fact, being vessels of that breath of life. And I would suggest to you that that process is, in fact, a profoundly spiritual one.
It's deep.
Do you want to say that again?
That's deep.
I'll try to be much lighter than the next response.
All right, so you've got people, I mean, everyone can see your list of recommendations. People like Deepak Chopra endorsing your book, and you're often seen as a spiritual as opposed to religious leader. Can you elaborate on that a little?
Yeah, you know, I think some of it has come in what a lot of people call interfaith work that many of us these days now refer to as interspiritual work, which I think is a more inclusive and accurate, perhaps, way to think of it. Over the last years, I found myself being introduced as the Buddhist Episcopalian, as if there's something wrong with that. I wear that as a, wow, was that an act of something?
We're listening.
So I will be much calmer. So I'm now often introduced as the Buddhist, Jewish, Unitarian, Sufi, mystic, Episcopalian, and maybe a few other things that tagged along. And I say all of that because that does happen, but also partly in jest, because I think part of what I write about in the book is I draw on the wisdom and the practices of many, many different traditions. I speak a lot in the book about the practice that I've learned from my Buddhist friends about detaching and about detachment. And I believe that that is a huge issue for those of us in the LGBT community. I think many of us have tried to rescue or save toxic situations. And when we do that, it is not life-giving to us or to the people whom we try to save. I also, I talk in the book about the wisdom that I have picked up from other traditions that invite me to think about going beyond this notion that exists in many spiritual creation stories about us being made in the image of a God or a creator, and instead invite people in the book to really think of ourselves as being made in the imagination of the universe or of a creator, wherever you happen to fall on that spectrum of belief. Because I think the mere shift of the image from, or the words from image to imagination invite a different response. To be part of the imagination of an ever-creating, ever-expanding universe means that that ever-creating, ever-changing, and deepening truth is also true in your own life. And so I write also about the way in which I believe that if there is to be a question asked of us of how we have lived our life someday, that the only answer that matters is whether you have loved and loved with abandonment.
So what would you say to people in the LGBT community and our allies as we deal with homophobia in many religious groups?
I believe that homophobia, because of the fear that it creates, and what that fear leads people to in terms of absolutely awful actions and physical and violent assault, verbal assault, and emotional assault, I believe that homophobia is evil. I believe it is evil. And I don't use that word lightly. I use it because I believe that the moral arc of the universe doesn't just bend towards justice, as Dr. Martin Luther King liked to say, but it also bends toward inclusion. And when we start to label people, and homophobia is a label, we do several things. And I invite you to think about it next time you label somebody, because we all label someone. None of us are free of that. You're typically asserting your own power over another person. You are secondly asserting your superiority over another person. And thirdly, you are probably fearful of something. And so I believe that it's important for us and for our allies to resist the evil of homophobia, and to do it with clarity, but also with a love and a compassion that is grounded from that place of knowing who you are. And I believe that we do it, one of the most effective ways in which we do it is through the telling of our stories. And I believe that one of the most significant moments in the life of the LGBT community and the arc of inclusion in the US was the institution of the very first coming out day. It terrified a lot of LGBT people. Are you really asking me to come out? But what it's done is it's made our stories and the stories of those we love real. They're not stories about the imagined, unnamed, fearful ones. They're about real, live human beings, and we all represent their hearts and their faces because they are us and we are them.
So real quick, how many of you guys went to Coming Out Day this year? Oh,
Yay,
right.
good, good.
Times are changing.
Yeah.
All right, so Desmond Tutu, he's your mentor, he's your friend. What have you learned from him?
Well, you know, firstly, it's been a very interesting relationship. It went from, you know, being this hero of mine who was just sort of an idyllic person and who was so unique in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. and whose life was protected because of, in part because of students on American campuses. And the South African government knew that they couldn't touch him. It was the only reason that he remained out of prison. There were a few other factors, which I'd be happy to talk about later, but, and so I tell the story in my book, in the pathway, about the power of connecting stories of my first one-on-one meeting with him. I was 22 and he was 49. And he was lying on a couch in his office and he said, "So Robert, tell me about yourself. Not what you've done, but who you are." And the story that I told him led him to burst out laughing. And I wondered what on earth I'd said. It turned out that the person I had included in my story was a man who had not only transformed my life, but had transformed Tutu's life when he was a teenager. And so we began this incredible bond, and what has turned from admiration of a hero to mentoring to a friendship that has gone on for 32 years. And I think some of the largest gifts that I've learned from him are, one, he is loyal to his friends, and he is generous. Tutu has certainly known what it's like to be among the firsts. He was the first black dean of a cathedral in South Africa. He was the first black archbishop. He was the first black head of the Council of Churches in South Africa, and it's a long list. And I remember in May of 2006, I had been up for election as Bishop of California, which is essentially the Bay Area. And it was an ugly, ugly election campaign. Churches and schools have the worst politics in the world. Of course, with the exception of USF. And so, you know, there'd been on the eve of the election a group of people who had communicated with me saying, "You've got this huge block of votes from us tomorrow morning." Well, of course, that didn't happen at all. And there were these, you know, this sort of awful innuendo and fear of electing another gay bishop. Turns out, 2 or 3 days later, Desmond Tutu was with me in Seattle for a prearranged event that he was coming to. And I picked him up, and as I'm driving, he's, you know, sitting here in the passenger seat next to me. And he put his hand on my knee, and he said, "Robert, how you doing?" He said, "Do you have lots of scars from California?" He knew what that process was like. He's loyal to his friends. He's also this remarkably impish, playful, and just wickedly funny human being. So I was hosting a breakfast 4 years ago in Seattle for an event called Seeds of Compassion. And it was at a hotel ballroom in Seattle. It was part of a 3-day event in which over 150,000 people would come and hear His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. And this was a much more intimate event. 450 people, started early in the morning. We knew the Dalai Lama would be late because of his extensive meditation practices. So Tutu and I get going, and I'm going to stand for this because it'll give you a sense of, so I'm at a podium just like that one in the banquet room, and Tutu is in one of 2 comfortable chairs sort of on the side that the Kindle's in. And we start this conversation about compassion, and then in walks the Dalai Lama. And he comes up onto the stage, and they bow to each other, they hug, they kiss. These 2 dear friends are so happy to be together again. And he sits down, and I pick up with where Tutu had left off, and I realized very quickly that nobody in the audience was paying any mind to anything that I was saying. And I looked over to my left, And what do I see but His Holiness the Dalai Lama moving his left elbow back and forth like this, repeatedly poking Tutu in the ribs. And so Tutu looks at him and he says, "What do you think you're doing?" And the Dalai Lama still keeps poking him, and he says, "You've gotten fat." And then, as if to add insult to injury, he says, "You've put on weight." And they both started laughing. Well, of course, the audience didn't know how to react. It was as though they had hit the pause button. And finally, they stopped laughing. And Tutu looks at the Dalai Lama, and he said, "You better behave yourself. Start acting like a holy man." Now, maybe only Desmond Tutu could say that to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. But I tell you that story, and of course at that moment the audience did join in the laughter. They realized it was okay. And I tell you the story because I think what I've learned is that here are these two iconic people who deal with so much evil and horror in the world and whose lives have been physically threatened. And there they are being playful with each other. And they have cultivated that sense of playfulness and delight in their everyday life through their respective spiritual traditions. And so I actually devote an entire chapter of the 7 chapters in the book on how to cultivate that kind of playfulness and that sense of feasting in the ordinary, everyday moments of life, because they make a difference in terms of how we are able to remain grounded and how we are able to engage in the issues around LGBT equality or any other cause that you might be involved with.
All right, so as we're wrapping up the evening, we're going to take it a little deep again. I want to know, what gives you hope and courage?
Kendall, I think the first thing that gives me hope and courage is probably every single person in this room tonight. Because I'm guessing that you are here because you care about human life that is magnificent. You care not just probably about LGBT issues, but you probably care about justice and what love and compassion look like in the world, not just for yourself, but for other people. And so I'm given courage and hope by you who are here tonight. I'm given courage and hope when I work with and have this incredible privilege of being in communication with people who I meet as I travel the country, who talk about maybe things they've learned from the book. And they want to talk about how they've taken some new step going to the edge of their own fear. And I believe that is where most of us are invited to our deepest and most profound growth, when we're willing to go to the edges of our fear. And so that, for me, is always hopeful and fills me with courage. And I'm filled with hope when people understand that love and courage in French have the same root word. So to say that you are courageous is not to think about the images of the warrior heroes who we put up in our city squares all over the country and all over the world. But to think of courageous people means to think about those who are expansive and generous in their love and how they seek to live their lives in the world. And when you love in that kind of way, you also take actions that are of courage and rooted in that courage, because you know that there is a profound anchoring truth to your life that is about love made known not just in your life, but in the connection of your life with the rest of the human family.
All right. well with that portion. I think we're ready for some question and answers.
I would love some questions and answers. This is the most fun part of the evening for me. Well, I can. You know, I talk in the book about coming to the U.S. alone, not knowing anyone. And I knew that in terms of surviving, I needed to create family around me. There was no biological family at that point. And so I put a lot of energy into friendships because my friends were my family. And I remember calling week after week one particular friend who I write about. His name is Sean. And hearing this tirade of what was wrong with the world and with his employer and with the neighborhood dry cleaner and the local Chinese takeout food place. And, you know, I mean, the list just went on. And I would always try to rescue. I would always try to offer some tools that maybe he could use to do the kind of inner work that would take him to a different place. And I finally realized one day that I was the one who was always making the call, and that it was not healthy for me, and it certainly was not healthy for him, because he probably hung up after talking to me and thinking, oh God, I just got another lecture, or, you know, why doesn't he stop, or whatever. And so with detachment, you actually offer someone to the universe with good intention, which is very different than getting angry and saying, you are a real bleep, bleep, bleep. And it's a way of saying, I offer you with love and compassion and hope for your highest good and your well-being. And you might even say, I pray or I hope that someday our lives will reconnect. And in fact, ours did reconnect a few decades later. And Sean had done the work. And he was a very different person. And so that would be an example. I also think that sometimes when there are folks within our family system who we know reject us because we are gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender, that I think many of us feel the desire to please, to have people say, oh yes, I do understand now. But we can't do that work for other people. We can be there if they're willing to meet us, but we can't be there to change their heart or mind. Only they can do that. So is that helpful? Yeah. Yeah, thank you. There are many questions in that. I think the folks who inspired me to think about being ordained were the clergy in South Africa who I saw engaged in the anti-apartheid movement. I was also captivated as a 14-year-old when my parents removed me from the state school system where I was doing very, very, very poorly, and moved me to a private school in which I did incredibly well. And so it was the cathedral school in Cape Town, and we would go into, so it was my first sustained encounter with organized religion. So what I heard on the one hand was this wonderful sort of ancient wisdom told through liturgy and music, and preaching that was about the stories of ordinary South Africans and the courage of those who persisted in their belief that apartheid could be overthrown without violence, which seemed to many people like madness. So I was drawn, I suppose, initially by that sense of deep and profound admiration. Once I was ordained in 1983 in New York, I was very out with the parish that hired me, but went through periods of being both in and out of the closet within the institution. It was very clear to me in the 80s that openly gay clergy were not employable in the church. There was a sense of terror of being found out. And so I lived in, as many of us have, being out to many, but closeted to many. And that did not feel right to me. It didn't feel like living a life of integrity, a life of wholeness, or a life of authenticity. And so working with a therapist and a spiritual guide, I really got to a place of saying, I never want anyone to be able to use my sexuality as a weapon against me. I cannot give that power to another human being, which is what I'd been doing. And with that, my life really did begin to shift in significant ways that I am grateful for. But I suspect that for many of us, whether we are part of the LGBT community or not, that those questions abound. How to be authentic, how to live a life of integrity. I also think that people try to pigeonhole us as just being that gay person. But I think that as we are authentic in the fullness of our interests and our passions, people really begin to see us as more than just a sexual identity. Thank you for that question. I think there are many people who do believe that their role and work is to be patient. I don't believe, and I may be treading, I'm going to tread very lightly with this, but I would be surprised if there was any Jew who was exterminated by the Nazis who would have said that that was better than, I'm not suggesting you're saying that, but by not speaking, or the world not speaking, that this horrible Holocaust had happened. And I say that because I believe that part of the path of spirituality is to be grounded in our story, because I believe that ancient wisdom and spiritual truth is revealed in our story. I also believe, and talk about this a lot in the book, that the spiritual path and the path to really imagining a new way to be human and actually practicing a new way to be involves claiming and celebrating our voice. And so patience may be a virtue in certain circumstances, and I don't deny that. I believe that squelching our voice or silencing our voice is in fact an entirely different proposition. And that when we are silent, we allow the very vocal and aggressive and hostile tyranny of minority groups who seek to demonize, whether it's us today or someone else tomorrow. I believe we give them power and by our silence. And so I would say to you that the spiritual life is about that breath of life flowing through you that allows you to actually celebrate your voice and to use it in a way that is very different than being silent. Well, I think it's a great question. Thank you for it. Homosexuality as we understand it today was not understood in the same way 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, or even perhaps just many decades ago. And so there are very, very few passages that even mention same-gender, what I might call attraction in the Bible. There's certainly very little said about what it means for how to live and how to be as an LGBT person today. And so, as with so many things that sacred texts don't address, because they weren't part of the human purview when the texts were written, is so what are the values that you draw out of those texts? Now, you could go to the Christian scripture and pull out lots of texts about judgment, and do that quite easily. But I believe that the arc of the scriptural story is really an arc about love. And it is about a love that does not have to be earned. It is a love that is freely given. And so I believe that the challenge for us is how do we live into that love that is given freely to us as we are as LGBT people? I think that is the more interesting question for us. So hope that that's helpful. I think the MCC Church is a remarkable gift, not just to the LGBT community, but also to many of our allies. And I think it has been a challenge and a witness to the other churches that exist. And for that, I just give great thanks and I rejoice greatly. So thank you. I believe that there is a certain thread that weaves its way through any kind of oppression. And that thread is the ugly notion that some people are less human than we are. It is the thread that says some people are worthy of less than others. It is the thread that says that I can, with complete impunity, engage in words or actions that seek to limit and enclose the lives of other human beings. And so, yes, I do believe that there's a thread. So thank you for asking that. Thank you for that. I think that the answer probably is varied depending upon what season of your life and journey you're on. I'm going to give a hypothetical here, but if you are somebody who has embraced the courage and love to come out, and you have been getting backlash from people using religion as a weapon against you, then it may be possible that what you need at that moment in your journey is to be part of a community where you're not going to have to fight those battles because you don't need to be assailed and you don't need your spirit to be assailed. But there may also be a season in your life where you go back and forth between an MCC church and some other church. You may say, it is part of my work to help educate and to be a witness in a community that is open to that. But that requires a certain sense of groundedness and walking into it with knowledge that it is not always going to be perhaps as spiritually affirming of you and for you. And so, you know, I believe that for many of us, we don't come out just in one moment. We come out over the course of a series of things. And in a sense, that is no different than the rest of our lives. There are events and moments that take us into new understandings of who we are, of how we engage with the world, how we engage with other people, how we engage with ourselves. And so I think the question for me is, so what does that mean for any of us in terms of being awake and aware and present to how you are living in the now? and trusting that how you will live in the future will be revealed to you when you are in that now. Wow, I've never been asked a question like that before. Thank you. You know, I'd probably, there are several groups that come to mind. I love speaking to high school students. I love speaking to college students, particularly in settings where you can do some kind of workshop work. And I love it because there are so many people who have not allowed themselves to take on the veil of jadedness or disillusionment about the world. And there are too many adult examples of people doing that all too easily as a way of withdrawing from their own life and from the life of the world. So I love that. I also, I enjoy on a very different level talking with folks who do not share my perspective on a whole host of issues. Because I believe that unless we're able to do that, the kind of divisiveness that we are seeing in the United States, and all of the research organizations have tons of data saying that there has never been as much discord and lack of, and so much polarity as there is right now. And unless we begin to engage and change that reality, I suspect we're in for a long period of incredible stasis that is not helpful to anyone except to those who want to manipulate cheap political slogans for their own benefit and their own power. And so I would say to you, that group is also a group that I love speaking with. But I think there's also a theme in the three groups that I've identified. And it is about knowing, embracing, and really delighting in the truth that we, individually and collectively, have the power to make enormous change in the world. And that every action and every word of yours helps to shift the consciousness of the universe. And that when we join with others in doing that, that astounding changes are possible. I would suggest that that would be a great conversation to have with leaders of the local LGBT community here in Tampa Bay. And we were in fact talking about some of that over lunch today. That huge sense of disconnect and how to shift that. It only happens typically when people get to know each other. And that requires vulnerability, and that requires settings that are safe and that can be trusted, and that it's not going to be a place for grandstanding. But I think you'd probably find a lot of people who'd be willing to engage in that kind of conversation. Well, yes, I would. I obviously don't know the landscape of the religious community in Tampa Bay, but I do know that there are congregations that are willing to engage in those conversations. And sometimes those who lead them need courage. They need to know that people are going to watch their back within their own community, that they're not going to be run out of town. So that's also a dynamic to be aware of. But often it is our LGBT allies who engage in those conversations very powerfully. You know, a parent goes to talk to their pastor and says, you know, I really didn't like it when you said something disparaging about a gay person in your sermon last week. And it's very personal to me. And let me tell you why. Because my daughter is a lesbian, and because I love her and her wife. And suddenly, the pastor is not in a situation of saying, oh, this is some, issue that I'm going to thump the pulpit about. But it actually affects the lives of people in my congregation. And I'll give you two examples that I believe help to back that up. One is that evangelical churches in the US 20 years ago preached about the evils of marriage and did not want divorced people to be part of their congregations. When they began to discover that the divorce rate was at around 50%, no matter what your religious affiliation was, they began to change their message, because suddenly they realized that they couldn't be preaching this message of hell, fire, and damnation to people who were sitting in the pews who had gone through the trauma of a divorce. Well, I think firstly it's don't fall into the trap of believing that that's where you need to go with Scripture. And yet it is very difficult, because you do hear the kind of thing that you're talking about being pronounced with the mantle of religious authority, which is what makes it even more frightening, because it is a real or an imagined power relationship. Because the clergy person who's inevitably doing that is in a position of power and presents her or himself as the guardian of spiritual truth, which he or she is not. And so I think, there are tons of resources online in terms of how people think about Scripture. I think that the research that has happened over the last 150 years around biblical scholarship reveals that, that Scripture is an evolving story. I love the sign that you see outside of UCC churches these days. They've sort of branded themselves with this wonderful slogan, God is still speaking, ... And I love that, because if the Creator is in fact those things, the Holy One, the Creator, is ever expanding and ever creating, just like we are. Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that it's only when we struggle with those judgments that are pronounced on us, or that we just know exist intuitively with someone. I think it's when we engage in those questions that we engage also with a willingness to see our own ability to judge other people. It's all too easy to say that person is awful because they judge. And their judgment may be awful, I'm not denying that for one moment. It may be horrific, in fact. But when we do that, we essentially start playing the game of righteousness. Who is more righteous? Who is less judgmental? That's not a winning formula for life, I believe. It's certainly not a way to think about a spirituality that grounds you in an inclusive view of the world. And so, in my own experience, I've certainly learned, as I have confronted the things that I have prejudice or fear about. And I suspect that that's true for most of us. Yeah, thank you for the question. The suicides of LGBT teens in various parts of the country is is tragic and heartbreaking. And I doubt that any one of us in this room has not been affected in some way by that news when we hear of those suicides. I would say to young people who are coming to terms with their sexuality to try to find some healthy role models. None of us can walk through this life alone. None of us have the resources to do that. And we certainly don't have it when we feel that our life is on the line because maybe our family is going to reject us, or we believe that our church is judging us, or whatever the case might be, or that we're being bullied or tormented, or when people in the locker room might try to simulate some sort of a rape. Those things happen to young people who are coming out all the time. Find mentors. Find people who you can be with, not because you only want to learn from how to be a healthy person within the LGBT community, within the human family, but because I would say to someone, you've also got something to learn, and people love to give. People love to be asked. And so don't ever be shy about that. I would also say surround yourself with people who love you. It is all too easy when you are in the midst of that coming out process to know the people who you are not feeling love from at that moment. And to stay and spend lots of time with them is not only toxic, but it is also draining of your spirit, and it is diminishing your love and your belovedness. And so I would really say those three things. And thank you for the question. Thank you for the question. You know, I'm going to just take a little diversion here. And I'm not leaving. I did not remember at the start of this evening to invite you to tweet anything that I say. And I don't know that you necessarily want to tweet what I'm about to say, but my handle is Robert V. Taylor, so just as you see it there. And the hashtag is a new way to be human, surprisingly. And I'm not sure what the USF handle is. If you do tweet and you want to include USF on that, I know that the Equality Florida one is Equality FL. Yeah. I believe that those who, firstly, studies show that that work is not successful, and it is in fact psychologically damaging. I deal with a high school friend who I'm still very close with, who, when his mother discovered that he was gay, sent him off to a treatment center in Texas for I believe it was 6 weeks of intensive shock therapy to change him. And she did it because she was a Christian woman. That's how she presented it. It could have been a Christian dad, you know. I believe that it damages the LGBT community because it holds out a myth that is simply not true. And it holds out a quote-unquote promise to some people that essentially invites them to violate their humanhood, their personhood, and their belovedness. So thank you for the question. Thank you. That's it's a big question, and I'm going to ask before I answer it, and because I know we're drawing probably to the end of our time, Brian, could I just give you these? Would you mind just sending them around? It's a sign-up sheet for anyone. I do a weekly inspirational message that goes out on a Sunday morning. It's called Wake Up Call, and that's because it gets delivered to people's inboxes around 6 a.m. in the morning. And so it's a free subscription. It's a sign-up for that, and also an occasional newsletter. So do not feel that you need to add your name to it. And if you do add your name to it and you hate the inspirational message, you can simply use that wonderful unsubscribe button. We are an incredibly violent society. We celebrate images of violence. Our most popular movies and TV shows are often those that are celebratory of violent activity. We also have unspoken violence that exists in our country. Sex trafficking in the US is only beginning to be spoken about in public forums right now. And it is an example of something that is incredibly violent and dehumanizing. We continue to engage in, I believe, superficial conversations about how to end violence, about gun control. And I think many people do believe that a non-violent resistance to any particular reality is a sign of perhaps passivity and of weakness. And I don't believe that for a moment. I think it requires an incredible grounding in courage and compassion. And if that is your compass, you will be able to speak out and act in ways that are nonviolent to change and overturn the violence. And it is possible to find allies to work with you. And I would suggest that on some level that is a profoundly spiritual quest. The impossible happened in South Africa. A violent system was overthrown in significant measure because there were millions and millions and millions of people who said a violent overthrow of the system is not going to be the way to go. And they refused to let go of that promise and that hope. You know, when we are in that place that says, I am good, I am beloved, and I am willing to work for my own well-being, some significant things happen. I believe that one of the great traps and dangers of much of what is presented as spirituality today is really purely focused on the self. It's all about me. I believe, and I write about this in the book, that inner work that has a focus on me, on you, on the journey, is absolutely vital and critical. But it doesn't ever stop there. Because when you seek your own well-being, you intuitively and instinctively want to work for the well-being of other people. When you know your own belovedness and how unconditionally you are loved, you naturally want other people to know that. And when you can say, I am good, you want and yearn for other people to be able to claim their goodness. Now, I've been challenged in a number of places about what I'm about to say. But I believe that we are each hardwired for goodness and for compassion. And it's only as we do that inner work that we're able to allow that to flourish and blossom and expand in our life, and to be, exactly as you describe it, part of the change in the world. So thank you for that. I'm not sure that anyone's ever asked me that question before, so thank you for that. I would say to you that the loving and just Holy One yearns for you to know your belovedness, and yearns for you to have your life flow with goodness and with delight, with compassion and with love, with justice and with mercy. And religions sometimes do that. But I believe that the question is ultimately about how you will allow all of that to be made manifest in your life. And so I would tell the person asking that question, do the work, because your life is a beautiful and sacred gift to yourself and to others. So do the work, and then worry about the faith or the religion. But if along the way you can find folks who are spiritual to support you and encourage you and maybe to give you resources for the journey, don't shy away from that either. So I hope that's helpful. Yeah. Thank you for the question. You're absolutely right. The latest poll from Pew Research that has been tracking religious trends in the US for decades shows that category of Americans who describe themselves as none, N-O-N-E, not affiliated with any organized religion, is on a constant upward curve. And that the highest percentage of people who describe themselves that way are under the age of 30. And the latest results of the Pew research shows that part of what drives people in that group of the nuns to say that I'm spiritual but not religious is they don't buy into the politics of religion, money, and abuse of power. And so those are significant challenges, and I believe opportunities of invitation to religious institutions, rather than something to scorn or to run away from. I think the question that you ask about this sense of a lack of community is really widespread across the country. Many people belong to religious organizations because they're after that sense of community, not necessarily because they buy into the entire baggage or the entire picture of what is being taught. And so I think there is increasingly a hunger driven, curiously enough, by technology and the internet. You can have, I think the last time I looked on my Facebook page, I could tell you that I had 4,993 friends. Now, you know, they're not folks who I can go and talk with about the struggles of my heart and my spirit. And that, I think, is the kind of community that you're talking about, which you probably don't even find in a religious congregation because it's too large for that. So part of what I observe going on as I travel the country constantly, talking, meeting with groups, teaching, leading workshops, and so on, is that people are self-selecting groups of community, although I suppose we've always done that. and might do it over a service project that they come together to do once a year. They might do it over discussion of a book or discussion of movies, but people finding creative, interesting ways to build community with folks who are willing to talk about spiritual resources and spiritual practices. And then there are others who join the things like meditation groups that are a different expression of community. And so I think the struggle for many people when they're looking for community is to say, where and how do I find that? And there are lots of options for doing so on the internet. I just discovered somebody made me aware of something called Meetup. And I thought, oh, that sounds like a kind of a little sleazy service of some kind. And why are you recommending this to me? What I in fact discovered is that, you know, you can go to Meetup and you can put in the zip code here in Tampa Bay and you could put in spirituality and it'll pop up maybe 20, 30 different groups that are meeting and are open to new members. So I think that there are ways to find community, but I always caution people or suggest that they have their antenna out. Look for communities that are healthy and are life-giving and that are not immersed in a purely inward focus. Well, I think it's, I think sometimes we look to and expect religious leaders and religious institutions to lead, when in fact they very often don't. And so I would suggest that sometimes it's not helpful to expect the leadership to come from religious communities. I believe that the seismic shifts that we are seeing in the US in terms of people's openness to the LGBT community, to freedom to marry, to marriage equality, is on some level just unbelievable. Who would have imagined the numbers being where they are today, even 5 or 6 years ago? And so I think you're going to start seeing the culture becoming increasingly more and more inclusive. And that's because of the work of LGBT organizations like Equality Florida and Pride Alliance and a whole host of others who are in the trenches doing great work, helping to change perceptions and understanding. And you're going to see religious groups following along, in part because they're going to need to, because we are often in those pews. Not always, but often. So I am aware that it is 8:30, and is that our time? Yeah. So I am going to be outside. There is a table at which we have virtual copies of my book available. They were supposed to be shipped, but because of the storm, they're in transit somewhere. But the USF bookstore has a table outside. You can actually, there is one copy that you can touch and see and make sure it's real. And if you choose to buy one tonight, I will autograph and inscribe a card to go in the book, which will come probably in the next 2 to 4 days or so, 2 to 5 days. And then, of course, the book is also available on e-readers and through online bookstores. But it would be really nice if you supported the local USF bookstore who have been so gracious tonight. And I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you, thank you, thank you. So.